hello everyone who's still here after 2 hours of English and not afraid of yet one more. My name is Kastytis Zubovas, and well, I'm one of the organizers here, so if anything's wrong with the convention, you know who to blame. And here are three of our esteemed guests, and I will be asking them silly questions about urban fantasy for the next hour. So, without further ado, I would like to start at a very low point with a really, really terrible question, just because it can only get better from there. So the question is about genre boundaries. And I know that genre boundaries is a topic that a lot of writers say is a stupid thing, but basically my question is, so you all write urban fantasy. What defines a work as a work of urban fantasy? How does it differ from other works of fantasy and from other works of urban literature? And must it be set in a city? And does every fantasy novel that's set in a city is an urban fantasy novel?
Well, I mean, first I've got to say that genre is a descriptive term. So genre is about descriptive, not prescriptive. So it's about, also it's genres are created by the Gestalt, by people. So they're very messy. So for example, you know, you have, like, you can say that historical novels are a genre, and that covers everything from kind of historical detective fiction to Georgette Heyer, you know. So when we talk about genre boundaries, you also have to make a distinction between genre boundaries, as in you look at something and you say, oh, that's urban fantasy, or are we talking about marketing categories, right, which is a completely different thing. And marketing categories don't always follow genre, are not the same thing as genre. For example, literary fiction is a marketing category, right, because you have lots of books, for example, Wolf Hall, which genre terms are historical novels, right, but are marketed as literary fiction because they think that's the best way to sell them. So because it, you know, appeals to a certain kind of posh person. So that's so that you've got to these things all tend to get mixed up in the discussion. So urban fantasy should really be called contemporary fantasy, but urban fantasy sounds better. So we call it urban fantasy because nobody was really thinking about it. No one came up and went, well, now we shall divide these things up into these genres. They call it urban fantasy because most of the contemporary fantasy was set in cities and was edgy and urban, like, man, in it. And so therefore, it doesn't have to be in a city. It just has to be contemporary. And if it's, say, Bas Pelt, or no, or what's his name? I've forgotten his name. China Mayville. That's not an urban fantasy in the sense of what we write, because it's actually a straight up fantasy. It just happens to be set in a city. You know, that's the way I look at it anyway.
Do you have anything to add?
We're already fighting over the microphone. Look at this.
You can borrow mine.
I'd feel slightly cheated if I saw something described as urban fantasy and it didn't have a city in it, you know, because I feel as though that kind of that's what the word brings. But one of the most important things, because we obviously we're independent authors as opposed to traditionally published authors, so to us what Amazon thinks is super important, because Amazon is the big daddy of how we get to market and sell our books. So we do care about that stuff because we're cheap and commercial. So it's very much in our interest to align with Amazon's view of the world. I know that sounds really terrible. I'm sorry. I'm such a slut. But there are people who will sell you analytics on this stuff. You can buy reports. It's probably like the thing that your publisher did for you, the PowerPoint presentation. We pay money to get the generic version of that. So you can download for money an urban fantasy report that will tell you. It will cover adjacent genres as well, but you can see what the covers look like. You can see what the tropes are that people use. You can.
Where do you get these things?
There's a company called Kalytics that produces them.
Oh, I'm so doing that tonight.
Yeah, do. It's fascinating. It costs about 30 quid.
I don't
think,
care. That's just fun. That's kind of
it's
geeky fun.
It is geeky fun. It's so interesting. We've probably got a couple on our laptop we can show you if you want. But, yeah, Kalytics. Sorry, I'm not pimping for them, but you can have the mic now.
No,
Thank you,
never
Heidi.
really useful things like that.
Key shareholder in Kalytics there. I mean, it's a really good. There is a question there because it used to be that genre was basically where bookshops put your book on a shelf. So here's the horror section, and there it goes on the the horror shelf. And then at some point in time, that became supernatural romance for a brief period.
I was there. I was working in a bookshop when that happened.
And suddenly, where's my horror books gone? And why are they all sparkly vampires now? And that's what it used to be, and now we live in, certainly Heidi and I live in a world, as you say, where it boils down to what Amazon say you are, which is ridiculous. So you write an urban fantasy in which a person gets divorced and recovers from that, and you'll discover you're number one in self-help guides, and you kind of go, that's not what I am, but it's what Amazon has decided. So you've got that question of what is urban fantasy, and obviously Ben mentions contemporary fantasy, so we talk about, I bumped into Neil Gaiman outside, and we were discussing his work. Now, I think, for instance, Neverwhere is an excellent archetypal example of urban fantasy. Now, does that mean Ocean at the End of the Lane, which is set in a much more rural setting, isn't urban fantasy? If we take the works of the comic book writer and author Alan Moore, where he sets his stuff in Northampton, which is technically a town, that's still very much urban fantasy. And similarly, if I'm writing a cozy mystery about witches at an academy, she's probably wearing quite a short skirt on the cover. Am I writing urban fantasy? I mean, all of those things have a stake in the game of being urban fantasy. But there is that element that when Heidi says urban fantasy, I immediately go Charles Stross or the Dresden Files or something like that. There's a thing that you go to, but I think what Ben says is absolutely correct. It's a descriptor. And by the way, Heidi, she's not a slut, okay? But we do link ourselves, we do lean ourselves towards, we want to write something like that. We're going to be like that thing over there. We are going to go in that direction. And so we angle ourselves towards that. Whereas I know earlier on, Ben, you were saying, for instance, you write a book for yourself almost. You write the book you want to write, and then it's someone else's problem as to where to put it.
Yeah, but I can say that I didn't know better to start with, and then after that it was too late.
Okay, and well, if we base genres on what Lithuanian bookshops put, or what shelves Lithuanian bookshops put things in, you'd be all children's writers.
Yay! Get him young.
Because almost all fantasy and even sci-fi ends up in children's sections for some reason. But anyway, that's a huge can of worms that we shouldn't open right now. Okay, moving on. A very different kind of question, so not directly about literature, but about what urban fantasy kind of does to cities, in the sense that, urban fantasy draws on myths and curiosities and, as you mentioned, the hidden spaces of cities. That kind of sounds, and you actually mentioned this in passing in jest, that actually kind of sounds like a dream come true for the tourism boards of cities. Do you think urban fantasy could be a viable way of advertising cities? And has it been attempted? Do you know?
No, I don't think so.
It's been attempted by me, but as we've all agreed, I am cheap and commercial. I think in the last presentation we mentioned the Birmingham Readers Map, which is a Google map I made of all the books that are set in Birmingham. So you can go to the map, you can go, I'm here. What books are set by me? Probably one exists for London. If somebody else will have thought of the idea, but I made the Birmingham one. And I did even try to get in touch with the tourism board at Birmingham saying, hey, this would be really good for your website. But they did not listen to me because, that just didn't happen. But it could have. If I have enough ideas like that, maybe somebody will listen to me. So yes, I actually think that now we've got augmented reality, that exact thing. very much like the statue over by the Museum of Modern Art, that you can scan a QR code and it tells you the statue's story. That, I think, was marvellous. And, more urban fantasy could be accessed in ways like that.
I think romance would be a better genre. I mean, one, it's read by a lot more people. And two, you're more likely to show the city in a good light. Fantasy, you're quite likely to blow bits of it up, go into the sewers of it, and have rats come out and gnaw on your face. Whereas I think a romance would probably be a better genre. If I was looking for tourism, romance would be a better genre.
I mean, there is the issue that all fiction is fantasy. In that sense, it's not real. For example, some of us may have seen the urban fantasy film Notting Hill, starring Hugh Grant, in which he lives in a London that I don't imagine any Londoner recognises at all. When we think of London, we think of, the London Underground, what a magical transportation, and it is magical, but it's also a bit horrible as well. Or we think about the tourist locales. We think of Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, and so on, and we romanticize. We create these mythic images of places. I've never been to New York, but I know exactly what I think it's like, and that's almost certainly a fantasy. So, in fact, urban fantasy is able to feed on those kinds of ideas of city as concept. Now, whether that actually helps, draw tourists to a place is an interesting thing. I think because in terms of drawing tourists to a place, you then think about film and about the visuals of a place and how that draws people in. And I think, again, the fantastical nature of cities and just the distilled idea of those cities. And I think particularly when you look at old cities and, London, Rome, Istanbul, wonderful example. They have so much, as Ben was saying earlier, layered history, that there's an inbuilt attraction of the mythology of those places. That's why you go. You go to Rome because of the myths and stories of Rome and all the amazing ancient stuff that's there, and then you realise it's quite a nice city as well. Not as tidy as Vilnius. But those things draw us in, I think. So, urban fantasy is an advert for cities, but probably not in a way you can measure.
I'd like to add that when you do go to New York, you do have this weird double effect where you're walking down the street going, I've never been here before, and yet it's weirdly familiar. You're sitting there going, I know that building, because people have run out of that building shooting people 5 or 6 times. I've seen that, and it's just very strange. You just go there, you kind of go, I know that building, I know that road, I know that street, and I found that very weird. And I imagine people do that for London. I'm an actual Londoner. So for me, London isn't I don't think I didn't go to St. Paul's until I did research there, or Madame Tussauds, or any of the kind of, my London is made up of my school, my hotel, where I went to school, where my friends lived and all that kind of stuff. If you're an actual Londoner, you see, there's a distinction between people who write about London like me, who are Londoners, and people who write about London who have come to London. For the people that come to London, London is a screen upon which they project their fears and their fantasies and their aspirations. That's why so many people write, State of Britain books set in London, which is the most absurd thing, if you think about it, to do ever. Should be set in Northampton, would be a better State of Britain. But for me, London is a small town, which just happens to be rather big, because it's where I went to school. It's where my first cinema was. I think I've got a mental map of London that consists of places I've snogged people, right? Where I made out with my first girlfriend. That's like a very impressive part. That's much more important to me than St. Paul's. That is, which hedge I fell into when I was very, very drunk when I was 17, and all that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of London that I try and convey in my books, rather than the St. Paul's and things. I forgot what we were talking about.
Tourist board.
Tourist board. Are we still talking about the tourist board?
We haven't moved on yet.
Oh, okay.
Well, I guess we can move on. So another thing, as urban fantasy writers and obviously readers, what would you say are the main trends of change and how has the genre changed over the past 30 or 50 years? Because I think that's about the total amount of history the genre has.
I would say that it's diversified because in subgenre, it's the spawn of like paranormal romance. It's kind of like urban fantasy with kind of like a large chunk of the urban kind of taken out. But and you know, but there was someone did a wonderful scan of, you probably know this because of your analytics stuff, but of all the women with bare backs. They did a wonderful musical video of all the various trends in urban paranormal fantasy books, and it's all women with like their bare backs, and then the ones where they had bodices, and then the ones where they had. And I thought that was fascinating. I really was quite disappointed not to have that on my book, to be totally honest. But it has diversified, so you have things like paranormal fantasy. You have people who specialize in werewolf versus vampire romances. You know, that's a fairly niche kind of category. And then on the other side, you have like detective stories, which is what I write, and which the Dresden books are. You know, detective stories about wizards who are detectives or detectives who are wizards. And you have that sort of level of the genre, and then you have like the more horror-themed kind of urban fantasy, which are all about the alienation of living in a city and how the underside of the city comes bubbling up to strangle you in your sleep if you're unlucky.
I think your point about the niches is the exact one that I was going to talk about, because if there's one thing that, you know, a modern marketplace, and it doesn't have to be Amazon actually, but it probably principally is. That it serves up, if it knows you like a thing like this, it will give you lots more of the thing that you like. So it's very good at serving niche customers with niche offerings, and that's what's happened. We've found all of these very specific niches, you know, the paranormal romance, the werewolf thing, whatever it is that you like, Amazon will make sure that you get more of it, because somebody in the world will be writing that, especially if they spot that it's a hot new niche. They'll be writing that stuff, and it'll just keep coming. Especially now they know about K analytics.
And I think this is probably longer than the history you describe. I think there's a specific shift in urban fantasy. I mean, I'd go back and say Franz Kafka was probably an urban fantasy writer. Bruno Schulz, urban fantasy writer. H.P. Lovecraft, urban fantasy writer. H.P. Lovecraft is one of those writers who I love to read, even though I know there's something deeply wrong going on there. And for H.P. Lovecraft, the city was a symbol for everything that was wrong. It was so when H.P. Lovecraft was talking about strange alien creatures living in his city, you know he wasn't talking about strange alien creatures. He was talking about those foreign people. And I think there is a sense within some urban fantasy that the horror of the city is this oppression of multiculturalism and so on. And obviously, it was like Heidi saying that to Ben as well, is that we've got to shift towards urban fantasy as both recognition of diversity and celebration of diversity. A city is a place where anything can happen, and it's where all things come to meet. You were referencing China Mieville before, who is in one sense an urban fantasist, but he writes books about Perdido Street Station and so on. Books about a city where literally anything can occur, and I think there is that total freedom of the urban environment as a space, which also links into the very modern notion that the city is a place where all life is available, all things are there for you, that, you know, any aspects of story as well as any kind of product or thing is on tap. You can step out your door, go down the street, turn 2 corners, and there is anything. And I think so there's that sense of celebration of the urban environment is much more common in urban fantasy, or if not that, at least acceptance that the urban environment is a perfectly normal, rational space.
Some of that's rooted in history because of things like of London. If you came to London, even if you were a peasant, well, more seriously, if you were a villein, and you were a serf, if you lived in London for a year and a day, you became a free man. And there's still that idea of the freedom of the city, that that if you come to the city, you can be free of the place that you came from. A lot of people come to cities to get free of the place. The people that come from small towns you've never heard of and all that kind of stuff. While a certain strata of the entire population of London is striving to buy houses in the small towns that no one's ever heard of, and which I always go, buy, personally. But I'm biased.
Right, I do have a few more questions, but I'd like to remind the audience that if you have any questions for our guests, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask those questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking them in English, don't worry, you can ask them in Lithuanian and I will translate. Or I will try to get them to give their best interpretation of what the question was. You can never know. Yes. Right, but in the meantime, a more personal question. What's your favorite city and why? Both real and fictional.
Well, my favourite fictional city is Ankh-Morpork. I mean, it's not the only favourite fiction, but if I had to rank them, it would be Ankh-Morpork. Not that I'd want to live there, but I think Ankh-Morpork would be my favourite
That was my next question. Which one would you want to visit?
I want to visit it, as long as, I was with Carrot, I'd be fine.
Yeah, does that mean I can't have it now that you've
Yeah,
had
no,
it?
you can have it. It's a big city.
Yeah. So, favourite real city? I am very fond of going to London, but mainly because I like to be able to step away again. London's very big. If you come from Birmingham, London's big. But I always think Birmingham is quite a small city. I know it's not geographically small, but if I walk around the city centre for long enough, I'll find somebody I know and I'll see things I'm familiar with. I go to London and every part of it is different, and it's a fantastic experience. But I like to go home. So whether that makes it my favourite city, I'm not sure.
You say a number of times I've got lost in the bloody train station in Birmingham. Just the train station.
Okay, favourite real city, I'm going to be boring and I'm going to say Birmingham. Heidi's not immediately from Birmingham, I only moved there 20 years ago, and I think actually
I was born there.
you're born in Birmingham. You don't live there anymore though.
Just outside, that's okay.
20 miles. So
I think if you
I think real cities, we learn to love the place we're in, and actually the longer we spend in a place, the more we delve beneath the surface and we find things. And I think it's one of those, I'm probably one of those individuals who I love the city more than the people who were born there, because I've come along and gone, and did you know this? There's a mine built under Birmingham University and the clock tower. It's the tallest freestanding tower in the world. And then people go, yeah, don't care. Because they're from but they've lived that experience, they know the experience. Those are, you could look at something with new eyes. I think in terms of, I had a really good fictional city in my head. I've completely forgotten it. I would like to, in terms of fictional cities, and I know it is London, but actually Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere as a city within a city, I've always thought that was a really fascinating, if slightly cheesy exploration of how the names of places dictate what a place is like. So in a London where Knightsbridge, there is a bridge and it has a knight on it, and there's an area, Earl's Court, and there is a court run by an earl, and the Seven Sisters are real people, and so that the names of places inform what a space is like. I think that kind of world is intrinsically fascinating.
But actually, Brentford is a ford over the Brent.
Ah.
A little bit of trivial information there for you.
I was going to mention, actually, I'll tell you my favourite fictional town. There is, and I'm not expecting anyone in the room to have heard of this one, there is I can't remember the guy's name who writes it, David Littler, I think, or Richard Littler, a town called Scarfolk in England. Back when we were all children, the government would put together public service announcements, little adverts of all the bad things you shouldn't do. You know, don't leave open that fire door, otherwise your house will catch fire. Or, you know, don't drop glass because people... And he invented this town, Scarfolk, where basically all of those bad things happen from the films, you know. and it's a horrible town of government control and sinister accidents, and I don't want to live there, by the way. You can't make me go there. But no, Scarfolk, I think, is absolutely fantastical creation.
I'd like to make an honourable mention to Ed McBain's Unnamed City. That's definitely not New York, because that after about 37 books, it began to really take on a character of its own, with like long histories about where the various areas came from, and it was getting as detailed as Middle Earth by the end of the series. So,
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay.
Hi. First of all, a small remark, if I may. You were talking about these stories to promote cities. Kaunas is doing that this year. It's the second city of Lithuania. Within capital of culture, they had this beast myth about a mysterious creature which is living under the city, something like that. So, yeah, cities do that for the tourism. And my question is just, what would you suggest to read for people who would like to get familiar with urban fantasy genre? And what would be the best examples? I mean, not necessarily some classic, maybe something, extraordinary and something people don't think about reading when they think about this genre.
You stole my next question, but okay.
I think my first introduction to urban fantasy was the stories of Charles de Lint, and which was set in, oh dear me, I want to say Minneapolis or Seattle, I've entirely forgotten which now. But very stories in which trolls and goblins and fairies lived in an American city, and very and basically thrust the fantasy world into the real world. And I think that was a lovely way for it to start. Now that was, I suppose, part of the founding of the urban fantasy genre. But first places to start are the books.
I will give a mention because if we want to look at the niche Amazon flavour of the world, we know somebody called R.E. Vance, and he has just taken this genre by storm. He's very successfully written some quite niche urban fantasy books, and he's become so successful that he's actually collaborating with other writers. He's getting other people to build out his world. It's set in is it set in a fictional Edinburgh? I think it is, or certainly a city that's based upon Edinburgh.
That's the Paradise Lot books.
Paradise Lot books, and yes, his model of creating books is just super interesting, and it's basically a kind of bed and breakfast. A hotel where all of the supernatural creatures bump into each other, and I've probably not made it sound as rich and interesting as it actually is with my description. But yeah, he's worth looking at.
I was going to say Charles de Lint. Serves me right. I think you can't really go wrong starting with a bit of Gaiman, or a bit of Mayville, bit of Gaiman, bit of Mayville, Perdido Street Station. I know we said it wasn't urban fantasy, but it's a good place to start. Neverwhere. And Nancy Boys is very accessible. I like to Nancy Boys a lot. So that by Gaiman. I'm trying to think. I know I can see all the bloody covers in front of my head with all the women with the swords and the barebacks, and I can't remember the bloody names of the books.
I think also in a slightly different field in terms of comics, Bill Willingham's Fables series, very successful, very readable. So it takes the standard class of characters from fairy tales, Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Pinocchio, and they have all been displaced from their land, and they all go and live in New York. There is an element where it is a very strong allegory for the displacement of Jewish people, and Bill Willingham makes no bones about this. But a series of comic books, long running, literally exploring how magical people are going to get by within a mundane environment. And I think the big bad wolf is the policeman / detective, and he's a great comic book character. And I think that is a lovely way in, very, very accessible.
Okay, I think we had another question.
Really connected with urban, but you mentioned quite a few times words like supernatural, fantasy, and real. How real is the things that you describe in your books for you?
Okay, I'll just repeat that mainly for the recording. So you mentioned a few times the terms like supernatural, fantasy, and real. And so how real are the things you describe in your books to you?
Well, I'm a complete materialist, so only the city is real.
That's interesting. I was going to use the word materialist as well. There's a thing, because Heidi and I write together. By the way, I've got the microphone. You can have it from me a minute. Where my background is in religion. That's why I studied at university, and we wrote a series of books about Satan living in Birmingham. And Heidi will say things. Heidi will say things like, "And we're going to have a Yeti in this one," and I will go, "No, because this is a world of Christian mythology, and this therefore is real, and therefore there are the rules of the mythology that, as far as I'm concerned, have to inherit. Even it's really stupid, and they are so stupid, these books, but there can't be any Yetis in them because it's Christian mythology and Jewish mythology and Muslim mythology." Similarly, with the Odd Jobs books that are our urban fantasy series, we would treat them, I think, as materialist, physical. So it is almost like an atheist mythology. We treat it as though there is a science behind it, there's a realism behind it. We were discussing earlier this idea about how you alienate people the more you move away from the here and the now, and I think that's one thing we've learned the hard way. When you talk about what's real and what's fantasy, the more things that are fantastical or unreal, the more you stand a chance of alienating the reader and them going, "Nah, it's just daft. I'm not doing that." Sorry, Heidi.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I heard your question, whether it's the way you intended or not, I'm not sure, but is how tangible can we make the fantastical? And I think that's one of the big advantages for setting something in a city where you can go and look at the things. You know, you can go to the places, and whether or not you can see the supernatural things, you can probably see the intention at least. I feel like we've mentioned Neil Gaiman a lot of times on this panel, but I heard him say something a few weeks ago about the time when he was living on the Isle of Skye, about the stones, because it's a sparse Scottish island, and there are stones there, and he was struck with the thought that even the stone that holds the lid onto his dustbin, stops it flying away, was probably a stone that had been handled by, prehistoric man, because there are only so many stones on this small island. And I think that I was telling Iain the other day, that put me in mind, in Birmingham there is a stone, it's quite a big stone, so it's not going to easily get moved out of the way, but it's called the War Stone, and there's an area of Birmingham that's named after it. And it turns out, if you go and look at it, there's a little plaque that says it's a thing called a glacial erratic, which means that a glacier dropped it there, because the type of stone that it's made out of came from Wales, and Wales is well over 100 kilometres away from Birmingham. So it was in a glacier, the glacier melted, and it's been in Birmingham since the Ice Age. And the fact that it's anomalous, it doesn't, it looks like it doesn't belong there because it's not the local stone, must have stood out to people for, hundreds, thousands of years, because its current name, the War Stone, is apparently a corruption. It was a boundary stone, so it was recognised by people for hundreds of years as, you want to turn left at that funny stone. It's that important, and now it's just sitting there on its little on the corner of Warstone Lane Cemetery, which is, I love things like that. You could just go there, you can touch that stone and know it's been there since, or thereabouts, since the Ice Age. It's that for me is very, we haven't put it in a book. I don't know why we haven't. It's very tangible. Things like that are very tangible. Sorry, I feel like I've gone off on one.
Actually, there is, sorry, apologies. There's another aspect of things that you find when you're doing research. There's these things called ooparts. That's OOPARTS, which are out-of-place artifacts, which are things that really exist but shouldn't. Usually things that exist historically, but they could not have existed at that time. We talked briefly when we did our talk earlier about an area called Moseley Bog, near where J.R.R. Tolkien grew up. And near there by the river are some stones which were, according to archaeologists, heated up and then dropped in water to create steam to basically make a sauna. But historically, archaeologically, they exist far earlier than people could have either occupied this area of land or indeed have had mastery of fire. So these, and obviously there will be one day a credible explanation for them. But these things, these ooparts, which are fantastical, but they exist in the real world. I bet London is full of them. Like things of, this is here. How could this be here? This is impossible. So you get the fantastical in the real every day. I've no idea if any of this has answered your question, by the way.
This fantastical element, how is it real for you? So, but yeah, it answered the question. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any more? Okay.
I'll try to convey it like there's some kind of a myth, maybe idea that writers, science fiction writers took, researchers took ideas or concepts from science fiction, good ideas or good applications, and tried to implement it. Maybe it drew some creativity from fiction, and maybe in urban literature it's flipped over, and writers are taking the worst from city architecture or the future of a city, like a dystopian, more like a dystopian view of a city, and it's more flipped. Are you influenced by the architects or visionaries, city and urban visionaries in your work, or it's only flipped and more dystopian view?
Got to talk about the library. What should we say about Birmingham Library, Heidi?
Is that the concrete one?
So you had Birmingham Library, which was a piece of brutalist architecture. It was an upside-down pyramid, and people hated it. I loved it. It was going to be a listed building. Then they replaced it with the big, shiny, new Library of Birmingham, the largest public library in Europe. Sorry, I'm just tourist board. Which is covered in gold and these circles and hoops and things. It's fantastic. And that immediately informed some of the fantasy that we were writing, that people build things, positive things, almost like a beacon of hope in this wonderful new public space. And I think so, that kind of stuff, the architecture informing what we do. The interesting one with, for instance, the Library of Birmingham, this amazing building, they finished building it. I'm not entirely sure if it's 100% connected, but just before the local council got involved in a nasty court case where they had to pay lots of people lots of money because they hadn't been paying them their wages. So they opened up this amazing, wonderful building and then had to basically cut its opening hours to almost nothing because they couldn't afford to open the building. So when we were writing fantasy, we made the kind of go, right, if I'm going to be a secret organization in Birmingham, I'll be in the library because it's a wonderful new space that no one's allowed in. Oh, why is no one allowed in? Oh, budget reasons. Not because there's a secret special organization hiding out in the library. I think architecture and space can inform stuff. I mean, without leaping on your bandwagon, but, having recently reread the original Rivers of London, the use of Covent Garden in the space and all the mythology and architecture around there surely informs the work there, doesn't it?
Well, the thing that interests me is systems, because I mean, part of what I try to do with my books is I try to show how crime is actually on an industrial scale is solved by systems. You don't. It's not like a guy going, "Oh, we've figured out who the murderer is." It's actually like hundreds of people doing lots of different things, some of whom don't even know why they're doing them. And like our society basically operates on that system, and a city is the epitome of people operating systems, interlocking systems that sometimes grind together like gears and sometimes work very smoothly. And architecture is part of that. But architecture is just part of what the discipline in the universities is called the built environment. And the built environment includes things like how you lay out your roads. For example, I notice you're narrowing some of these very wide roads you've got in Vilnius. And the reason you're doing that is because if you have a very wide road, people drive faster down it. And if they drive faster down it, it means it's harder to cross, and especially since you guys have got, you're not allowed to cross it when you like. You see, in London, you have absolute right of way, unless it's a kind of dual carriageway. You can walk across the road, and if someone hits you, they're at fault. Lots of people don't know that because we've got out of the habit of leaping in front of cars. But if we were to, it would be their fault. And so you narrow the road so the traffic goes slower, but it goes smoother because it's going slower. And that's part of the built environment. That's a system that comes from studying how the built environment works. And that's all part of architecture. But the fun thing about architects is they don't care about people. They're interested in volume and space and silhouette. You see, and they're not actually that bothered about what you're going to do once you're in there. And this is why so much modern housing is so awful, because you go in and the rooms are really weird shapes, and you go, why is this room a kind of useless shape for a bedroom? And they go, well, because it's like the volume. And you go, I'm going to make you live in here now. I think all architects should be made to live in houses. I mean, it's just, I hate the bastards. But that is actually something that inspires the work.
Yeah. Moving away from fantasy, because we also write science fiction as well, I think one of the things that it is that notion of the systems of the urban environment. Things, for instance, and this may not seem to be specifically about the city, but it works in cities. The idea that, I don't know how Lithuania compares to other countries, but how face recognition is used more and more day to day. How, for instance, you might be required to go through a face recognition scanner to get inside buildings. For instance, how that therefore, not through the fault of any one person at all, but for instance, facial recognition systems, they've all been developed, tested out on white men, and funnily enough, they're very good at recognizing white men, but they're not very good at recognizing women or non-white people. The same systems that, for instance, now, when they're looking at CCTV, if they see a white hand holding a hairdryer, they go, it's a white hand holding a hairdryer. If they see a black hand holding a hairdryer, they'll identify a black hand holding a gun. Systems which, if we look at systems like in the cities of China, whereby you need to use facial recognition to get on public transport, but if you don't have enough social credits, so you've not been to visit your grandma, or you've not put out your bins that week, you don't get to go on the public transport. They're all technological ones, but they are systems of the urban environment that actually are the kind of wonderful, horrible things writers can enjoy getting angry about.
My favourite facial recognition thing is the fact that I got a phone, and they updated me because my phone, I dropped it in some coffee, and I upgraded to a new iPhone which didn't have a button, which I liked, had a facial recognition system just in time for the pandemic. So now you're walking around with a mask on your face, and when you need your phone really quickly, you look at it and it doesn't know who the hell you are, and you have to and it's in a mask. You're already in a bad mood because you're wearing a mask and trying to bloody get your digits in. And I thought, really, I had a thumb button. I like the thumb button. I don't see why we couldn't keep the thumb button.
You've just reminded, because this is one of our favourite areas of discussion, actually, where systems and global corporations and some of the future technology that might alter the way that society works, where those things all collide. We're very interested in that. So it makes me realise that we didn't mention in this sort of roundup of great authors to look at, we didn't mention Charles Stross or Cory Doctorow, who both explore those sorts of themes and super interesting writers they are too.
Oh yeah, the Atrocity exhibition, if you want a good urban fantasy starting place. Very funny, very gory.
Yeah, just to remind you, Charles Stross was our guest in the last Lithuanicon, and you can find our talk with him on YouTube. Now, going back to literature more directly, and kind of segue from Ostea's question about how to get into urban fantasy. Well, I'll ask you to be the Amazon algorithms for a little bit. So let's say somebody has read all of your works and comes to you for advice of what to read next. What do you recommend?
No, you can't authorize that question for one thing, right? That's what you were going to be pointing you at people who should rivals, right? Okay, you have to understand. We don't even like telling people how to write books well because we don't need the competition. Personally, there's only so many niches for writers out there.
That scratches off my next question.
So we get a little bit of a problem with the whole Amazon algorithm because we write across genres. Actually, we don't just write urban fantasy. So we try and coax people to read our other stuff because why wouldn't we? But for each of our book series, depending on the specific genre that they hit, there will be different suggestions from Amazon. So I'm trying to think hard. Who do we get? Can you?
Well, I think because we've mentioned Charles Stross, the Atrocity Archive, and we wrote the Odd Job series. So the Odd Job series, a government agency based in Birmingham, whose job it is basically to make sure all the bad stuff happens smoothly and that no one causes a fuss and everything stays quiet. And we wrote the book, and then we went to our book illustrator and went, oh, it's a laundry files book type thing then. And then we kind of went, what? And we'd not heard of Charles Stross at that point, because if we'd read Charles Stross before we wrote Odd Jobs, we'd have just gone, we are horrible plagiarists, because it's playing in the same field. And again, I'll be brutally honest, because Rivers of London came out about 4 years before the first Odd Jobs book, and I think if I'd read Rivers of London first, and then I'd gone, oh yeah, we just switched police to sort of like Secret Service. So a lot of people play around in the same pool, and I think you have those different flavors. With the Odd Jobs books, we've very much gone for kind of like a cosmic horror kind of vibe, and there's still people who enjoy writing those, who still produce work in that kind of genre. And I think as well, there's people you'd like to be compared to. But I think it's down to the reader to decide that, really, isn't it?
I thought of somebody we've not previously mentioned. So actually, one of the people who I know our readers definitely enjoy, and his name has not come up yet, is Keith MacDonald. And he writes urban fantasy under the name C.K. MacDonald, because he has two strands to his... The Stranger Times it's a newspaper set in Manchester, and their job is to report on the supernatural oddnesses that go on around the place. And of course, the twist that you have going on here is they are the only people that know it's real. So that's a really fun series that's not too far underway. So yeah, hop on that bandwagon because it's really
I've had that recommended to me. I'll give that a go. Mind you, I've got to read through all your stuff now. And the analytics.
Well, so as I said, my last question is scratched off by Ben's comment, but... we have someone. Yep.
I have a question about questions. So, in your opinion, what is the question to life, the universe, and everything?
Okay, so in your opinion, what's the question to the life, the universe, and everything?
The question, not the answer.
We all know the answer.
Someone phoning with the answer there.
I think it's probably the age at which you've got over youth, because youth is just ridiculous, because we're all ridiculous when we're young, and you haven't yet petered out into middle age. So I actually feel like, 42, if I could go back to being 42, I could do stuff. Oh my God. You'd got enough years ahead of you to make a significant difference in the world. by the way, I just gave the game away. I am slightly older than 42, but yeah, it's a good age. Look forward to it.
Okay. Any more suggestions?
Not for that question, no. I don't do epistemology, so.
Okay. Any more questions about life, the universe, and everything?
We can narrow the focus a little bit.
That was a very broad question, wasn't it?
Okay, Vedvila.
A lot of leftover questions that I didn't have enough time to ask Ben, so, but it's even better now because I really wanted to ask, when did you start considering or calling yourself, a writer, an author? Is it when your first book got published, or is it when you started writing? When is that line? What line do you have to cross to start?
Well, I started as a scriptwriter, so you're a kind of aspiring writer until someone pays you. But that's a very mercenary world, scriptwriting. And then after that, I could just tag writer, even for the 20 years in which nobody was paying me to do anything. And then finally, when I had a book, I could go, I'm a writer. I love, actually, by the way, going through customs now, because you go, what is your profession? You put writer. Suckers. Sorry, that's my general attitude. You are a writer if you write. So a lot of people come in and go, I want to be a writer, or I have a book inside me. If it's still inside you, you're not a writer. That's basically the rule. If the book has come out of you, you might be a writer. It's a bit like Schrodinger's cat, right? You could be a writer or you could not be a writer. You have to open the box to find out.
I'm going to agree with that enormously. I'm of the opinion that anybody who writes a book, even if nothing happens to it at all, anyone who writes a book just deserves a medal for having written a book. Ben used earlier in a previous discussion the marathon analogy. You have done the very hard thing. So if you write, you are a writer. I think the question is actually, at what point did I start introducing myself at parties as, oh, hello, I'm Iain, I'm a writer. And that probably, it shouldn't, I call anyone who is writing something at the moment or has written something, you are a writer. But I think on a personal level, it was probably when I started getting money for it.
I think because the next question will be, when are you published or where are you published? And if you haven't got an answer for that question, then people start backing away, especially at parties. So, just to be on the safe side, when you're being paid, that's when you should tell people at parties.
I'm going to just address a specifically female and hopefully historic point here, because I wrote all of my life, but I think taking myself seriously as a writer didn't come till I'd done the children and got the family out of the way, because there used to be a really quite harmful cliche, I think. In England, for a very short while, because it was so bad, there was a terrible sitcom called You Must Be the Husband, where the wife had written a romance novel, kept it hidden away, but secretly got it published and made tons of money. Apart from the fact that doesn't happen anyway, it sort of gave credence to that idea that you can go and be a writer quietly and then not tell anybody and then it be a huge success. And it's nonsense, and it's harmful nonsense. So I think I properly became a writer when I joined a writers group and started talking to other writers and discussing writing and really digging into what it means to hone your work and get it better and share it with other people. So yes, sorry to go off on a mildly ranty thing, but let's hope those days are behind us. It's okay to write. It's not a shameful habit. You need to hide your manuscript in the knicker drawer.
Just to build on that rant, actually, it always struck me when you look at the history of writers in sort of like the 19th and early 20th century, how many of them couldn't have been writers if it wasn't for the fact that some poor sort of a wife was beavering away. I remember my mum used to take us out in the rain when we were kids so that my dad would have time to do some writing, and I'm glad to say nobody's ever done that for me. So, even though I asked them very nicely.
I think there's also, I'm going to say a couple of things, but there's also a point about, I don't know if this is part of the British character, but we the part of the British characters, we don't like people who build themselves up and say that they're good at something. We don't like it. So usually, if you met someone at a party and you went, "Oh, hello, I'm Ian, I'm a writer," there will be a couple of English words, a couple of vulgar English words that will immediately pop into people's heads. You go, "Wanker," you know. We don't like people who set themselves up as something. I think that's part of the issue. But what I would actually argue genuinely, and I think this is true, when you were children, I'm going to look at a child now in a creepy manner. When you were children, you make stories in your head. You tell yourself stories. We all do. We play make-believe. We do things. We tell stories. We write stories. We draw stories. And then at some point, most of us stop. So actually, I think for many of us, actually, the question isn't when did you become a writer. It's actually for most other people, when did you stop being a writer? Because actually for many people of us who are writers, we just keep doing the thing that we dreamt about doing as children and perhaps then put it on a bit of paper. And in fact, writing is one of those magical, one of those wonderful things that we just keep doing and you just need to persist with.
I had an adjacent revelation to that, which is one day I worked out that you kind of feel the part of your brain that's working when you're writing, and I realized it was exactly the same part of my brain that used to come up with excuses as to why I'd lost a pound note or something when my mum said, "What did you do?" And I was going down the street and this dog attacked me, and I just realized it was exactly the same part of my brain that operates when I'm doing that, and I thought, wow, it's just lying. We just lie for a living. It's great.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time for any more questions. So let's thank our guests again for putting up with my questions.